Hello and welcome, everyone. We want to let you know that we are recording this session. Once we reach capacity, people will be directed to our YouTube simulcast. My name is Amy Reinhardt. I'm the program manager for AP's Local News AI Initiative. I'm joining from AP headquarters in New York. This webinar aims to go beyond the headlines to explain how the technology that underpins ChatGPT might be useful for the news industry. Our panel will help us to understand this topic from a variety of angles and includes Professor Nicholas Diakopoulos from Northwestern, Ethan Hu from Schibsted, Claire Leibowitz from Partnership on AI, Hank Sims from Lost Coast Outpost, Miranda Marcus from BBC News Lab, and Edward Tien, creator of GPT-0. So last week, more than 450 of you responded to our survey to help us optimize this session. Thanks for that. Most of you who responded have experimented with generative AI technologies, but don't regularly use generative AI in your work. A majority believe generative AI creates new opportunities for journalists, and almost 3/4 of respondents believe AI can take on repetitive tasks, which correlates with our earlier research. Product manager Ernest Kung and I have begun working with newsrooms on these issues, learning what is needed through surveys and report, providing training and developing projects. We are currently building 5 newsroom projects, many of which use GPT-3 technology. These projects were selected because we believe they have the potential to scale to other newsrooms. Helping news organizations better understand these technologies is a goal of AP and of the Local News AI program. We are in the same boat with you. We are fascinated and also want to figure it out. A few housekeeping notes. You can pose questions in the Q&A box on Zoom. And if you're joining us from YouTube, please use the chat feature. We are grateful to the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation for supporting AP's Local News AI Initiative and this webinar. I'd like to introduce Nick Diakopoulos. Nick is an associate professor in communication studies and computer science at Northwestern University, where he directs the computational journalism lab. Nick is joining us on sabbatical from Amsterdam and will set the table on the technology behind the hype.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nick. Today, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of generative AI and its use in news production. So let's start here. What is generative AI anyway? Here's a basic definition. It's not magic. These are just very powerful statistical models that have been developed using machine learning. So these generative AI models, they can simulate outputs that are recognizable media like text, images, and video. And those simulations are based on all of the content that the model was trained on. Let's go to the next slide. How does this work? You know, one of the most powerful things about generative AI is that you can control it using natural language. You could kind of almost think of it like a sophisticated text completion engine. So if your prompt is the famous Yoda quote, "Do or do not, there is no ... the model will generate the final word of the quote, try, since statistically speaking, try is the most likely next word based on all of the training data. So it's really helpful to think and remember that these AI systems are fundamentally just statistical text generators. They've learned from lots and lots of data, including books and Wikipedia and online news, and they're able to generate the next word, one word at a time. Let's go to the next slide. A key skill in working with generative AI is actually figuring out how to prompt the thing. This is how you control the model and how you provide your intent and the context for the tasks that you want the model to help with. You kind of need to play with these models to develop an intuition for what they can and can't do. But also, if you're trying to accomplish a very complex task that works with different inputs, you're going to need to iterate a lot to get the system to do what you want and to evaluate the generalizable performance across different inputs. Let's move to the next slide. Now, there are a range of issues that can pop up when you're trying to work responsibly with generative AI. You can see them laid out on the slide here. Top of mind for many journalists is the accuracy issue. In my evaluation of the ChatGPT integration with Bing search, I found that almost half of the responses had some kind of accuracy issue, including issues related to provenance or attribution of where information comes from. We've also seen instances of news publishers getting caught publishing AI written text without adequate editorial oversight. And so for the time being, I think it's best to have someone checking everything carefully before publication. There are other issues like confidentiality and privacy issues that crop up since AI providers by default can use the data that you input to their service to improve their service. That might mean that you don't want to use documents from an investigative project, for example. The other issue that crops up here because of third-party AI providers is that you need to adhere to their terms of service, which, for instance, for OpenAI, in their case, they have a labeling requirement if you're using their API for news generation or news summarization. There may also be some copyright or plagiarism concerns here. There's evidence in the research literature that models can memorize snippets of text from their training data and could then regurgitate that text back. And because I think it's kind of easier to see some of those issues in visual data with image generators, we've already seen actually some legal activity amongst artists suing some of the providers there. In OpenAI's case, they actually assign all the responsibility to you, the user, for the content that you generate. There's also social biases in the data used to train these models. So you need to be thinking about possible representational harms in generated outputs. There's the anthropomorphism issue, the idea that we imbue these tools with human qualities. But of course, we know, as I said before, that these are just statistical text generators. They generate one word at a time. They don't have feelings. They don't have intents and motivations. They don't take initiative. They don't have big abstract ideas. They just work one word at a time. And finally, it's worth noting that these things can get pricey to develop. If you're trying lots of different prompts to debug them, you could easily run up a tab in the hundreds of dollars. And so you'll need to do some cost-benefit calculations to see if it actually makes sense to use this kind of technology. Next slide, please. So there's various capabilities of these models, some of which are more analytic, like classifying and extracting data, whereas others are more synthetic or generative, like rewriting, personalizing, or ideating. You really need to think about the various newsroom tasks that you might encounter. And here's a list of some of them on the right. And of course, you can think creatively about how the capabilities that are there intersect with the specifics of each task. Some of the pitfalls I mentioned on the last slide are less of an issue if you use the models for internal newsroom tasks, things like discovery or tips processing. These kinds of back office tasks, I think, are more where the sweet spot is for the current version of the technology. In some of my research, we've actually worked on integrating GPT into news discovery processes to help journalists ideate on news angles. And I have to say the user response for these tools has been very, very positive. If you offer some transparency and journalists kind of know what they're looking at, they can interpret it appropriately. And so this is kind of an ideal use of the tool as a thinking augmentation. A lot of the excitement is also on the use of GPT for public-facing outputs, right? So actually doing the writing. And this is where it gets a little dicey and hits tensions with issues of accuracy, possible copyright, and plagiarism. So if we're talking about social media content creation, automated writing, newsletters, and these kinds of things, these are all tasks that require some aspect of the generative capabilities, which of course has those accuracy issues. Now, this might improve with some better prompting. The tech is going to improve, but you're definitely going to want to have humans integrated into the publishing loop to check content carefully before publication. So let's go to the last slide here. So recently I launched the Generative AI in the Newsroom project with the goal of collaboratively figuring out the responsible use of generative AI in news production. You can check it out at generative-ai-newsroom.com. And this is going to take some creativity. So if you're interested in working on this and figuring out how to apply generative AI in the newsroom, send me a pitch for a use case. I'm going to work with some of the selected projects as a technical consultant to help think through how to make the idea work and how to evaluate it. So check out the site for more details there. And thanks again. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Nick. So next we'll hear from Ethan Hu, joining us from Norway. Ethan is a user experience designer with a background in visual effects. She is now driving innovation for Schibsted brands and will explain a recent GPT-3 experiment.
Hi everyone, my name is Ethan. I'm a UX designer from Schibsted's Futures Lab, and our lab is a very small team of designers and technologists, tinkering with emerging technologies and finding their potential impacts on our brands and customers. So here I am today to share one experiment that we run with our news media brands to sort of explore large language models, whether it could improve our journalistic workflows. So back in the summer 2022, we did a number of experiments with GPT-3. We ended up building a summarization tool to help generate shorter versions of news articles. So here on the right-hand side is a graph that sort of demonstrates how we built our prototype. So we started off by gathering data sets from two of our main publishers, one from Norway and one from Sweden. Each data set contains a number of articles paired with their corresponding human written summaries. In total, we had 1,100 pairs for the Norwegian data set and 2,500 pairs for the Swedish one. Then we fed these data sets into GPT-3, and GPT-3 turned them into fine-tuned models. These models can replicate summaries in the length and tone of voice of these two publishers. And the results show that the Swedish model could produce summaries that are comparable to human written ones. And 90% of the summaries are factually correct. So next, we built an API within our own infrastructure that enabled our partners in news media to start integrating the summarizer into their own products and workflow. So in the next slide, can we go to the one before? Oh, the one after, sorry. There should be one called CNP Live. Yeah, brilliant, thank you. So we integrated the summarizer into our content management system called CNP Live. CNP Live is used throughout all of our publishers, and it's used for publishing live feeds such as the war in Ukraine. There is a section on the right-hand side column where we get external articles from wire services, and these articles are often too long to publish. So here what we did, by adding the summarize button, our web editors could quickly summarize articles with our AI model, then use it as a draft for further editing. So if we could go back to the Snapchat slide, please. Thank you. So here's another example from our Norwegian news brand VG. So their team built a Snapchat creation tool where you copy paste the link of their news article and it automatically imports a title, leads, byline, and image to sort of formulate a Snapchat feed. Here the manual work lies in writing a summary for the body text. And this is again where our summarizer came in to help speed up the process. And as you can see from the image, on the 1st of November 2022, VG actually published a Snapchat feed where the summary was generated by AI. So these are all the slides I have. And just to wrap up, I want to share some high-level insights of how this new summarizer was perceived by our news media brands. So we interviewed 15 editorial staff across 5 publishers from Norway and Sweden, including the ones who were more reluctant towards AI. And initially, our biggest concern was that they would be resistant to generative AI entering the workplace because they perceive it as a threat to their roles in the organization. However, after testing out these demos with them, seeing the summary results, and also explaining a little bit about the underlying technology, they started seeing the real use case, and they became more open, and many were eager to adopt these AI tools. Of course, while we were testing, we caught some factual errors caused by AI hallucination, and some of the language, of course, can be improved. But this whole process helped all of us to understand the importance of having human in the loop. Considering where the technology is at today, AI is not a replacement. However, our newsroom can leverage it in different ways for efficiency gains. That's my message. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ethan. It's amazing when you get people to adopt tools like that. So it's a great use case. Next up, we have Miranda Marcus, who is joining us from London and leads BBC News Lab. The lab combines the expertise of journalists and developers working across BBC News. Miranda will explain how BBC News Lab is approaching generative AI.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for that introduction. So I run BBC News Labs, which is a similar team to the team we just heard about. It's a cross-functional team that sits in the newsroom, but combines engineering and editorial expertise. And we've been thinking across BBC News's very diverse output about what the impact of generative AI can be. And of course, we have 42 languages, we've got radio, we've got TV, there's a lot of online material in lots of different formats as well. So there's a really diverse set of use cases to be thinking about. And overall, we're trying to think very broadly about both, I really like the phrase that was used earlier, newsroom tasks, but also wider production use cases as well. So we've been thinking about ways of supporting journalists and production teams to make innovative content today, and to free up their time to be really focusing on impactful journalism as opposed to those day-to-day tasks, which take a lot of time. But also thinking about what new forms of storytelling can be unlocked by these types of capabilities, and also how we might be able to address some of the broader challenges that are facing the news industry today. For example, disinformation, lack of trust, et cetera, which is why we are running the hackathon, which tickets just went live today for. It's a free, open, in-person 2-day hackathon where we'll be looking at the use of generative AI to address news avoidance. And I think that the wonderful team at AP will be sharing the link for that at some point. Just this image here, if you wouldn't mind clicking and playing the video there, if it's possible. This is just a small bit of prototyping that we've been doing, similarly to the previous talk, looking at the semi-automation of explainers for technical terms within an article to make them more accessible and more inclusive to a broader range of audiences. Next slide, please. But the really important thing there is to say that we are building that very much with a mindset to experimenting responsibly. So we're trying to make sure that we build in, for example, significant air gaps between anything that's generated automatically with generative capabilities and what lands for an audience-facing article, and making sure, as other speakers have acknowledged, that we have plenty of humans in the loop before, and lots of time before it hits the audiences. But really, we are trying to make sure that we are engaging with the opportunities here. So thinking about trialing and experimenting with different models, different combinations of models, and building on things like the BBC's machine learning engine principles, which are already part of our ways of working for things like recommendation engines, but really working cross-departmentally with, for example, editorial policy and legal, and of course engineering, to be thinking about what points of different, what are the different ways of working, what are the different considerations that we might need to have for these types of capabilities. Next slide, please. Because really the impact is far beyond journalists. Obviously, we're here to talk about journalism, and that's the focus of the talk here. But from our perspective in News Labs, looking across the very, very diverse sets of teams that contribute in the broadest sense to news making and production, we can see that this GIF on the right is from the GitHub Copilot, which is a generative application that creates code. So what does it mean for coding applications? What does it mean for the end-to-end generation of metadata and the wider application of the use of that metadata, be it for flexible media, object-based media, but also things like rights management? For TV production, we have a whole world of potential there around responsive and anticipatory studio direction, which we're only just starting to scratch the surface of. And obviously from a multilingual perspective, and thinking about world service, things like voice cloning are complex, but how can we think about the opportunities for really engaging with far more diverse global audiences in ways that really resonate with them? So really, we're trying to not get swept away in all of this opportunity, but really think about it in a broad, holistic, and cross-departmental way, and really looking forward to getting into the conversation a little bit more. Thanks very much. That's the end of my slides.
Thank you, Miranda. I appreciate it. Our next panelist is Hank Sims. He's the editor and lead developer of Lost Coast Outpost, a tech-forward, hyperlocal website. Hank joins us from California. He caught our team's attention during a class this past September when he said he was already using generative AI on his website. Welcome, Hank.
Hi, Amy. How are you?
Good, thanks. Why did you decide to try generative AI?
Well, it became, the DALL-E had a moment in the news there, and it was my video not started? Sorry, here we go. DALL-E had a moment in the news there, and we realized at that moment that we could use it for stock art, places where we would otherwise search out like sort of maybe boring flat stock photography. And so we started using occasionally DALL-E to illustrate some stories when appropriate.
Okay, and is it difficult to implement? Not DALL-E, because I think that that's kind of grab and go, but the other things that were like Agendizer, which you'll walk us through next, is it difficult to implement and maintain, and what level of coding skills do you need to have?
Yeah, this, which we'll talk about a little bit more, is fairly difficult to maintain, and you'd need some coding skills for sure to do it. Most of it is not in the generative AI part, which that has a very simple API.
Kitchen, isn't he?
That you can call at any time. But yes, it is my kitchen.
On this, right?
They're
all 4.5 minutes.
I think somebody's mic is on.
I think John's mic is on. If you could mute that in the control room, please.
Thanks. So the hard part here is not the generative AI part, but the system that we use to gather the agendas of local governmental agencies, the board of directors of those agencies, such as city councils, school boards, planning commissions, and our county board of supervisors, which are automatically scraped now into our system. That's the hard part.
But that's what you built, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you built your website so it's one of a kind, and I think you said that that is what makes this feature like Agendizer easier to do than if you had an out-of-the-box content management system.
Yeah, so a lot of small newsrooms like ours use WordPress or some sort of out-of-the-box solution like that, which doesn't allow you to sort of customize it in the way that you would like. So an off-the-shelf CMS will give you like 85% of what you want to do, but it's that extra 15% that makes your website special, we found.
Okay, well, let's get into Agendizer. You said that you built scrapers to go after City Hall meeting agendas and the like. Can you explain what we're looking at here on this slide?
Yeah, so this is the main page for that, and you'll see. I don't think you can scroll down, but on our site, if you go, and Amy will send you the link afterwards. But it will show all the upcoming meetings and all the past meetings of local government agencies that we're monitoring in this way. And once you click those, then you'll get that agenda in a sort of standardized format. And
how much does it cost to run every month?
I mean, this costs us about $10 a month.
Okay.
Yeah, just about that.
Okay, and so let's walk through some of the Agendizer. Can you go to the next slide, please? Great. So what are we looking at here, Hank?
So this is a story that was written by one of our writers, Isabella Vander Heiden, previewing the upcoming meeting of the Eureka City Council. It's the big city where we live. And the part that she wrote the headline here, she wrote the body of the story, but it was based on what our system, our Agendizer, had already brought into our website. So when you go down a little bit, I think maybe the next slide.
On the next slide, yeah.
Yeah, what this is then now there's the agenda, like I say, written in a standardized format. And as you see, the part that's highlighted there is the summary that was created by GPT-3 of the documentation supporting this item on our city council agenda.
Great. So this is the $10 a month thing, right?
Yeah, this is what costs. Yeah.
Okay.
And, go ahead.
And on the next slide, this is the fun part. Can you explain this?
Yeah, so in addition to like the standard straight summary that we have of this agenda item, that again is like based on large documents that are handed, large and bureaucratic documents that are handed to our city council. We have it in addition to providing the straight standard summary, a sort of fun thing. We have a sort of a set of prompts that we deal out at random and that will write a sea shanty in this case based on the item that they're discussing.
Great. So on the next slide, you're using DALL-E here. Are you worried about putting local artists out of work?
No, we're not, because in this case, so this is an image that we generated, an illustration of this story that that a local housing local coalition was looking to house homeless families. We could have used some sort of stock art, some photo that we'd run before of homelessness in Humboldt County, but we gave this a shot because it took it takes us like a minute, and it costs pennies to do, and it gives you a nice sort of image that to illustrate the story. We're not putting any artists out of business, because we would never in any case hire someone to create that painting for us.
Right.
So we're a small newsroom, we're a locally owned small newsroom, and we don't have infinite resources and infinite time to employ such people. In all our cases, when we're using generative AI, we're not replacing people. We're using it to do things that weren't possible for us to do before.
Got it. Thank you so much, Hank. I appreciate you walking us through Lost Coast Outpost's innovation efforts. Next is Edward Tien, a computer science student at Princeton, who built a chat GPT checker called GPT-0. He's joining us from New Jersey, and will explain how he created GPT-0 and how chat GPT might be useful to journalists.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, Amy. Oh yeah, the slide you see here is pretty much GPT-0. During this talk, you're more than welcome to just go to gpt0.me and try it out while I talk. But I'll give you the story behind building GPT-0, both the story that's been covered by the media, and also sort of, which is not not a false narrative at all, and also the real story behind the scenes. So I'm studying computer science and journalism at Princeton. I was doing my undergrad thesis research on AI detection, and I've been interested in this for a while. And over holiday break, I was just home, got pretty bored, did all the sort of like holiday things, but then also wanted to code something. And I thought, hey, I had this AI detection technology pretty early on, just on my laptop. No one else is really building AI detection then. It's mid-December. And I want to do it because there's a need. So sort of over a few days at my local coffee shop, I built out GPT-0 and just launched it for anybody to use. And the crazy thing is it did go viral, and now over 1.8 million people have tried GPT-0, which is just a crazy number to even think about. And I think the narrative that's been pushed, and it's not wrong, is what we're focusing on is education, because aside from journalists, the people most worried about AI and generative AI technology are educators and how it's disrupting the school system. And I would say the narrative there has been like mixed as well. There's one side, it's, hey, the student is a snitch building this technology to catch students, which I would say I'm not against students using generative AI. I think it's absolutely the future. It's here to stay. Students deserve to be exposed to it, but we need to use it responsibly. And on the other side, I would say, yeah, right in the start of January, when the New York City school system issued a ban of ChatGPT, I was one of the first people to just come out and speak and say, that's not the right solution. This technology is here. You're not trying to get around it. It's like we have to adopt it responsibly. And now that's been more of an accepted view in education. Say the real story is, I didn't really care about the education use case when I was building this at first. I think the real use case I cared about was journalism in terms of media and disinformation. And Miranda might be happy to hear this, but I previously spent a gap year working for the BBC and working with the BBC disinformation team. I spent that year looking at detecting bots. And already then we were looking at these giant Twitter campaigns of like bots and Facebook bots that used AI to generate their faces. And I remember then, like, we had techniques of detecting the current model of facial generation, which really popular in 2020 with StyleGAN 3, and detecting, hey, this is an AI bot, and these are fake human faces. And I think just over the past month or so, for me, it was like, wow, we're opening a Pandora's box in AI and generative AI technology, because I imagine these bots now can talk like humans. And that poses a lot of consequential potential problems and risks in terms of spreading disinformation and fake news. And that was the primary motivation for me going into it and building GPT Zero, the journalism side. I would say, yeah, I would say in terms of technology and how I think about it as both a computer science student, but I'm also studying journalism at school, and have spent years working for incredible newsrooms, the BBC iInvestigations, as well as Bellingcat, which is an organization you may or may not have heard of, that really like does a lot of great verification and sort of like pursuing the truth work. I would say most technology has been in the history of everything imposed on journalism and adopted in journalism from the back end. Like when you think of like technology like SEO optimization, as well as even like Facebook, where now a majority of local newsrooms get traction from sites like Facebook. And all of this is on the back end, and all of this are sort of more imposed onto journalism. And what's, I guess, more exciting to me is to start thinking about how we can transition that from journalistic technology to be adopted by the front end, and how it can empower journalists instead. And I'd say how this looks like for GPT Zero and what we want to do next is a few things. It looks like what we're building, just aside from the AI detection, is we're also building a Chrome extension that everybody can use. And it's supposed to do a few things, not just detect AI text, but we're also putting this into this Chrome extension, detection of biases and toxicity in writing. And also, we're also highlighting areas of unique and original writing, because it's interesting to think about that the same technologies you use to detect what's most AI or machine can also be flipped around to detect what's most human in writing, and sort of like skip the drudgery of writing. But what's exciting of this extension is this is more for journalists and everyone that's reading news, because it's sort of a new window you need to look into this world of news and internet and everything, as there's more and more generative AI technologies, and it's sort of proliferated everywhere. And a last interesting thought that we want to also look into adding, and this goes into how we can use AI technologies to empower journalists on the front end, is also verification in terms of, hey, like there's actually a great paper, Carlene and al., that over 6% of these large language models, they're actually like memorizing over 6% of its content. And that's crazy. It means like sometimes your writing is being taken and trained into these large language models, and maybe even verbatim outputted. And it would be a really awesome service that we're also thinking of building, as you have a Chrome extension that detects all the AI text that's being put out on the internet. There's another service we can provide for journalists where they can check, hey, is my writing and my writing style being repeated on the internet? And those are the things that really excite me. And those are the things where we want to build GPT Zero towards, starting from AI detection into a tool that can also empower journalists from the front end. Or from the back end, it might be just like a tool of like, hey, generative AI to help write your articles, which doesn't make sense. That's sort of like adopting the technology from the back end and imposing it on journalism, which to me, I think we need to have a shift in that mindset, especially in the world of computer science. That mindset needs to be shifted.
Yeah,
Thanks
so
awesome.
much, Edward. Just as a reminder, he did this over the weekend, so clearly I need to make better use of my time. Thank you, Edward.
Yeah,
our last presenter is Claire Leibowitz. She'll share some ethical considerations of GPT-3 for the news industry. Claire leads the AI and Media Integrity Program at Partnership on AI and joins us from New York.
Thanks, Amy, and for having me, and for everyone who's spoken already. I'll start by introducing the Partnership on AI, which will give context into the aperture I approach these questions from. I think John may be off mute. Thanks, John. Then I will offer a provocation, and then we'll dive into two aspects of our work, which is guidelines on generative media and then our AI and local news project specifically. So the Partnership on AI, where I lead our AI and media integrity program, was founded a little over 5 years ago by the heads of AI research at some of the largest technology companies. So Facebook, Apple, Amazon, DeepMind, IBM, Microsoft, and Google. And our origin story conveys how we think about the broader AI field, in that this collection of actors realized technology development and policy development around these tools warrants cross-sector collaboration. So the societal impact transcends any one institution or field, whether it's journalism or technology, and therefore we need everyone at the table in order to create a pro-social outcome for that technology. So we have over 100 partners, from civil society like the ACLU to industry like OpenAI, and even in media and journalism. If we can just go back a few slides, even though I like the depiction of our partners on that one. And together we create best practices for a broad spectrum of topics, including generative media. And 4 years ago, we began working on generative media, mostly with this perspective that we need to align on a shared set of principles and guidelines. Of course, within journalism, there's a strong sense of ethical standards, but how do we as a field, especially in the institutions that are building many of the technologies that they may then be adopted by people like Hank or others in different fields, how do we instill some of those values there as well? So I'll offer a provocation, which is that over our 4 years working in this space, we recognize that while there should be collective action on values and an identification of what it means to do this ethically, and Amy, you brought up some of those questions around copyright and dual use, there should also be very specific practices for different sectors, because the impact of the technology varies sector to sector and industry to industry. And I'll describe this a bit more. And something that's been heartening to me is we've heard education examples on this call of journalism. And I know we're very focused on journalism, but many of the people building these technologies, the Microsofts, the large institutions, are not just thinking about journalism as the use case. So how do we embed some of the values from this community in the development of those practices? And I also want to underscore something I've heard over the course of this conversation, which is that even within one institution, there are so many different use cases for this technology. Even within the BBC, who we collaborate with, they may be, as Miranda described all those examples, obfuscating faces and telling a story about the Hong Kong protests, which I know they use. So privacy preserving mechanisms from generative AI. But also at the same time, they may be concerned about the veracity of video evidence coming into their newsroom, because they might not be able to know as readily if that's real or synthetic or generated. So this presents this capacity for the technology we've been hearing today to be used for creative purposes, to save time, to tell stories more meaningfully, and at the same time to cast doubt on material and potentially disenfranchise or disempower. So at PAI over the past year, and we can go to the next slide, we've been working with over 100 institutions to put pen to paper on an initial set of practices and values for 3 types of actors in the generative AI space: creators, infrastructure and technology providers, and then distributors. And in that category, we include both large platforms and media. And while everyone here may be most fixated on the recommendations for media, we think that by galvanizing the broader field, we are better able to attend to the values at the kind of end stage of the generative media process, also in embedding those in maybe how OpenAI develops its tools, or how even a dating app, which may seem totally disconnected from the journalism community, is deploying some of the same mechanisms for detection that Edward talked about, and even other ideas around how synthetic content might be permissible or not on their platform, so that by coalescing this community, we can do that more meaningfully. And this is an initial set of practices that will also serve as a complement to broader regulation and policy, which touches, of course, many different fields as well. And you can check that out at syntheticmedia.partnershiponai.org. And in the next slide, I would just love to introduce our more news-specific work. So we have a program on AI and local news and how we can allow and enable newsrooms to embed AI tools, not just generative media, but across the board in their newsroom. Because while generative media is getting a lot of attention, we also recognize there are lots of kind of lower tech tools that are really useful for empowering newsrooms to save time, to tell more meaningful stories, et cetera. So we have a database of tools that helps kind of demystify them. We've heard lots of questions from journalists. How expensive is it? How much technical literacy do you need? I think you asked that question, Amy, to Hank about how hard is this to use? And it's very unclear often in when people describe these tools what that is. So in this area of work, we want to imbue this community with kind of a sense of dual use and ethics as they are thinking about other meaningful metrics for deployment. So while you're thinking about cost savings and time savings, and also the potential, beauty of a story, can we ask those questions about copyright? Can we also think about how we provide a disclosure statement to users and audiences about how we've used generative media? So I encourage you to also check out that work as well. And I thank Amy and all my co-panelists for their insights.
Thanks so much, Claire. I'd like to invite all of the panelists to turn their cameras on and unmute. We have gotten a lot of questions in. We'd also request that if you're a journalist and you're interested in covering this, please observe Chatham House rules. And you can also follow up with the people on this webinar. We will provide, again, links to their work, which will enable you to find them. So, Local News AI product manager Ernest Kung has been filtering through questions and joins us from Los Angeles. Ernest.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for your interest in generative AI. Thank you for panelists for joining us. So next few minutes, we've got quite a few questions here. The first question is to the panel, to the entire panel. Will newsrooms that do not use AI features still be viable in the future? Does anybody want to take a crack at that?
Yes, I can take a crack at that or start. I think it would be a disservice if we're entering in a world where no one knows if something's AI written or human written, and it's almost like a sad world for me to think about, and like this hypothetical world 5 or 10 years down the line where everyone's using like AI to write their articles and everyone's like writing the same, and it's so gray, and it's kind of sad. And when I think of that world, it'll be more important to distinguish or know what's most human or most original, being able to write beautifully in terms of prose that generative AI can never do is going to be even more of value. I think entering that world, the key point of, yes, there will be value in even journalists and newsrooms that don't use AI is if readers can know the difference, because humans care, whether it's whether you're a reader that wants to make sure facts are correct, then obviously you want to read writing and know when writing is being made by AI, because as the other panelists pointed out, a host of problems there, as well as implicitly, I think we as humans do care and there's still value there. So the answer is yes, as long as we build the tools to distinguish between what is human and what is AI.
Yeah, I would agree with Edward there. I mean, I think there's absolutely a future for people in the newsroom. That future might look a little bit different in terms of the types of skills that you need to be effective. But there's absolutely going to be a demand for high quality, original content, investigative journalism. Also, we need to think about, people consume news media for different reasons. Not everyone is there to get breaking news or get some little factoid about something. Sometimes people want a story, they want a narrative, they want the human interest. None of these things are things that GPT can really deliver on right now. The gap between what they can do and what people can still offer in terms of the experiences that people want from the media is still substantial. And so I see a future that is hybridized, where you have people working together with the generative AI to create new opportunities and personalization, new kinds of content, perhaps taking care of some of the drudgery. But I don't see a huge hit to employment right now.
Can I offer an additional thought? The question is about AI more broadly, and I agree with what Nick and Edward just said. And at the same time, I have this general allergy to blanket statements about like AI technology because there's so many different use cases and everyone has a different archetype or heuristic in their head when they're thinking about what that means. So my blanket statement is like, everyone will probably find some piece of the generative AI pie that amplifies their newsroom. But how do you instill some introspection or skepticism in why we are deploying those tools in the first place? So one area of work that we're working on is this kind of like AI procurement guidebook on what should you ask yourself before deciding if this task warrants an AI tool. And I'm very cognizant that we don't want you to sit there and analyze this like an academic, but how do we practically articulate what makes sense for us to deploy? And that, I think, will ensure that we're adopting the tools that lead to this more pro-social outcome for the field, rather than kind of just grasping onto tools that have nice design, are really in the zeitgeist, and therefore seem like you need to do that to keep up with other people in technology development.
Great, thank you.
Perfect. And a question for open also to the panel is about reader disclosures when using generative AI. At what point or what level would you say ethics demand a need to disclose the use of AI in creating our work? And it sort of comes back to Claire perhaps, but for everybody else as well.
Be quiet afterward, but in our framework, which I encourage you to read, and I'll describe less eloquently than it's in there, there's a section around disclosure, and this is for audiovisual artifacts, which I actually think is a meaningful distinction. When you're writing an article, there are different mechanisms for incorporating something into the byline, for example, than in a visual artifact. You can have signals in the content or around the content, etc. But we basically differentiate between direct and indirect disclosure. In the direct disclosure realm, there are actually technical signals you can embed into audiovisual content that imply where it came from, its source, certain implications of authenticity, for example. And for more, that's indirect disclosure. And then for direct disclosure, there are some recommendations for labels, watermarking, context clues around, I know it sounds silly, context clues, but how do you have kind of those types of things? So there's a precedent we have for visual content, and also different for text. However, I want to give one example of sometimes the unintended consequences of these mechanisms of disclosure. So when Twitter rolled out their manipulated media labels several years ago, which were little indicators that content they perceived to be manipulated, we ran a user study that was published at a big computer science conference, talking to end users and audiences from different ends of the political spectrum about their perceptions of this disclosure mechanism. And one guy who lives very vividly in my psyche said that they thought the Twitter manipulated media label was Twitter telling him the media was manipulating him, which is a potent example of how important it is that even this like very noble, visceral aspiration towards disclosure can backfire depending on attitudes and inclinations towards the individual putting out the disclosure. So not an answer, but something to think about as we really move towards disclosure.
So, I mean, there is this strong normative element too in journalism towards disclosure. I mean, there's certainly been examples from the AP as well as many others where bylining automated content is kind of a standard. I also want to bring up the European perspective, since I am sitting in Amsterdam here, learning about EU regulations as they relate to AI, the EU AI Act. And it's not law yet, but it's coming most likely later this year. And there will be a labeling requirement for audiovisual deepfake material. They're discussing how and whether that may be extended to a labeling requirement for synthetic text. Still being sorted out, the specifics of it. But if you are generating content that you want to have available in Europe, in the European market, you may well need to start thinking about labeling as well.
Great, thank you.
Miranda.
Hank
had a
Miranda.
point. I'll leave room for
What
Hank.
a nice panel. What a nice panel. Go ahead, Hank.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that just as a working journalist, I think that it's very important, like Nick was just saying, to disclose everything all the time. We have we have bylines that indicate when something is written by the AI, and in a cut line we'll put that exactly how the image was generated. That's it.
All right. And we have a question for Yifan. A lot of people were asking about Summarizer. And so they had a question right now about the accuracy of it. And you had mentioned about 90% factual accuracy. A tool that produces potentially 10% of error, there's a bit of risk in using that. How do you guys address that? What is your approach to it?
We would definitely keep human in the loop. That's the one answer. Keep human in the loop. Do the fact checking before publish any content. I mean, when we tested the tools, a lot of the journalists did express their concern over AI hallucination. What if, okay, there's like misinformation appear in the content and they accidentally hit the publish button without checking. And so, for example, in our design process, we'll add some frictions to sort of, like stop them from auto-publishing content without checking. Maybe we can add like sanity check, going through names, address, data, and all that, just to make sure, double check, triple check, all the information are correct. So yeah, I just want to mention that human in the loop is absolutely essential before publishing anything generated by AI.
All right. And then if you could quickly define hallucination, because another person did ask that and you just mentioned it again.
All right. I think Nick might be the better person, but I'll give it a try. So that refers to generative AI imagining things. For example, from our summaries, AI generated summaries, we saw names that were not in the original article. But this name could be a journalist name that was stored in the data set we use for training. So maybe AI assumed that is a good thing to have in the generative version. So sometimes we see like random names or places appeared in the summaries, but these things I think they're easy to check if we keep some mechanism in the design loop. So if that answers the question, and Nick is happy about it.
And a question for Miranda. There is a lot of interest in what BBC Labs is doing for obvious reasons. The question is about AI solutions for news avoidance and fatigue. If you could explain a little more about the recommendations and contextualization that applies with that goal in mind.
So can I just make sure I've got the question right? So we're talking about like news avoidance, the fatigue of news that leads to news avoidance, and how we might be able to use these capabilities for that. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. The short answer is not sure yet, but we feel like it's really important that the BBC that there's create spaces for those types of things to be considered. There is a huge amount, as we can see from this call, a huge amount of really productive thinking and experimentation happening around practical solutions that help journalists do the business of journalism right now. The newsroom tasks that Nick mentioned, but the BBC is one of the biggest public service media organizations in the world, and we have a responsibility to also be creating spaces and leading the thinking around how we can utilize this tooling and these capabilities for furthering public service values, and being able to think about that outside of a commercial framework. That's why we're setting up this and running this event and doing it openly with newsrooms, hopefully from around the world. Please sign up. And want to think about that together with different journalists from different contexts. We know from lots of research that news avoidance and fatigue of news is a global, is happening globally for all audiences and for many, many, many publications. I'm going to probably say all publications. And there's lots of actually very logical reasons that drive that behavior. So can we understand that more, and can we use the capabilities of generative AI to start addressing those in a meaningful way, not just wholesale pump out the same stories in the same way that we're currently making, but to really understand what type of news media would make a difference in people's lives and enable them to feel, for example, more empowered, more engaged, more able to engage, for example, with democratic functions, institutions, norms, whatever. You know, and we need to have a really serious conversation about what role public service media could and should be playing in that field as well. But I think that this is a really there's an opportunity to use this as a catalyst for having that conversation in a new way. So hope that's a bit of a don't know, but this is why we're thinking about it. Hopefully that answers the question a bit.
Perfect. And this is one last question. We do have an international audience with us. We had over 1,100 people watching us live at this webinar today. And so they had a very interesting question about languages. How well does generative AI right now perform in languages other than English?
Well, it works pretty well. Well, before generative AI, there was already significant capabilities around multilingual solutions and translation and transcription, which is actually key. The transcription part of things is actually what's really opening up new forms of new workflows and new kind of journalistic capabilities, because if you can extract the metadata from speech to text, for example, using models such as OpenAI's Whisper, other models are available, then you have all that metadata available to transcribe. What we're finding is that speech to text is now much better at different accents and things like that, which again opens up new capabilities and new possibilities with a lot more accuracy and a lot more speed and efficiency. News Labs, in collaboration with a number of other media organizations and academic organizations, actually just finished a piece of work called Gourmet, which produced language models trained on news media content for a number of, at the time, under-resourced languages. So at the time, there were languages like Pashto and Tamil, where there wasn't really the commercial incentive for organizations like Amazon to be creating and maintaining high quality translation models. It's possible that these types of capabilities will fill that void, and that actually there'll be more equity in the languages that are well served. That's another element of this. And finally, what I'll say is that actually a lot of those capabilities, they're just improved, and you can be a lot more effective. But linking those capabilities with other forms of generative media, so linking them with LLP or NLP or synthetic voices or things like that, we really need to think through the ethics of that. We really need to think through what the implications are of that type of reversioning, but it does unlock some new opportunities for telling stories in new ways.
Okay. And we have far more questions in the Q&A available than we have time for in this webinar, but we will attempt to answer some of them in our Slack channel, which Amy will have some details about back in New York.
Yep. So we're at time. I want to thank our panelists, Nick, Ethan, Claire, Miranda, Hank, and Edward. Thanks to Ernest for helping to produce this webinar and sorting through all of those questions. Thank you to the AP team members, Jessica Buller, Lauren Easton, Mirko Fainza, Lisa Gibbs, John Kelleher, Nancy Nussbaum, Nicole Meyer, Dan McCarry, Calvin Rayner, Kevin Spinelli, Rob Weisenfeld, and Julie Yee. Yep. These things don't happen alone. We will send a follow-up email with the links related to our conversation today and also include a short survey. Now, by taking the survey, you'll help steer our work and next steps for AP's Local News AI. You can also stay connected with us through our Slack channel by indicating interest in the survey. So click on the survey. I'm Amy Reinhardt at AP headquarters in New York. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.